Right, chapter 1, how to think like a leader. In many ways, this chapter frames the heart of the book, and any book about leadership has either an implicit or explicit assumption about what leadership is. This book really tried to get at the heart of what biblical Christ-like leadership looks like, and it's really, the heart of it is service, a heart to serve. And while many leaders, whether it's in the business world or in politics, are motivated by ambition, the argument and the foundation of this chapter in this book in its entirety is really that the heart and the motivation of biblical leaders is service. Even in the way we talk about leadership in Christian circles, we still often undermine that by saying things like, you serve so that one day you can lead. And what you're saying is sort of service is just your stepping stone to eventually become a leader. Leading is your best way to serve. Leading is the way to take initiative and leverage all the influence and the team and everything you have to be a servant. So that's the core of this chapter. In many ways, the foundation for the rest of the book, the kind of leader that this book and the principles of this book are trying to produce. So when we think about this, what are some of the experiences you had, or you highlight some of them in this chapter, or people you saw you thought, that is servant leadership, that's what we're trying to produce?
Last night, I was talking to one of our church planters who has planted an amazing church in Boston. And I visited him a couple of years ago, and he took me to the service quite early and put me in a room to pray and prepare for what I was about to preach for the two services. And he went in the other room and began assembling the stage and connecting the wires and putting the drum kit together and stacking the chairs and setting up the kids' ministry along with a handful of volunteers. A few years later, I was meeting with a group of church planters, and they were talking about the universal struggle that church planters have with mobile churches, where they set up in a movie theater, or this was in a gym, in a YMCA gym, and they were all moaning about the common problem of church planters of not having enough volunteers. But my friend in Boston said, when it got his turn, he said, I've never had a problem with volunteers. In fact, what I noticed the Sunday I was there were more volunteers than they could actually use. And I think there's obviously a connection with the senior pastor actually going there and leading the team to set up, and then he would go change into a different shirt and go up and preach and lead worship and do everything else a church planter does. But the example of serving in that context, and I spoke to him last night and I said, how's that going now? Are you still doing that? He said, we're 6 years into the church plant. It's a huge church for his city, and he's still doing it. He's still leading the setup team. He's still the first one there, stacking chairs and plugging in microphone wires and assembling the stage and putting up the banners. And then after the ministry time, when the second service is over, then he's the one leading the crews to break it all down and put it in the boxes, and then doing it again Sunday night at a different venue. So 2 services in the morning and then 1 in the evening. But that the leader was serving that way set an example that the whole church was following, to the point where, very uncharacteristic of young church plants, there were more than enough volunteers. And I think sometimes if we underestimate the power of example of a leader. And I think when we talk about leadership in this book, we've been talking about how with every leadership situation there's a heart and there's a skill. And I think there's always that idea that David led with an upright heart and with skillful hands. And so I think this chapter, as much as anything in this whole book, establishes the heart of leadership, which is the heart of a servant. The text is in Mark chapter 10. It's a familiar passage for most people. In verse 35, it says, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him and said to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And that's a little bit backwards, that they're asking Jesus, hey, Jesus, we want you to do what we say. We're supposed to go to Jesus and say, whatever you say, we'll do, but they had that backwards. In verse 36, he said to them, what do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. And Jesus said to them, you do not know what you're asking. And then down in verse 41, he says, the 10 heard about this, and they were indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. And so Jesus takes Gentile and their minds were the people far from God. And so Jesus says, you're thinking like a Gentile about leadership. The Gentiles will see leadership as lording over people, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. And so Jesus is comparing the thinking about leadership like a Gentile as an authority structure and as a lording over and as a hierarchy. I'm here, you're here, sizing everyone up. He goes, not so with you. You need to think not like a Gentile, but think like a servant. And then Jesus goes on to say, that's why I came, to serve. And as William pointed out, sometimes we see serving as a means to an end instead of seeing the leadership position as the means to the end, which is serving. And Jesus' point was to come to serve. Serving was not the means to the end. Serving was the end. It was the point, to come and serve and give his life for many. And so in leadership, we don't ever outgrow serving. And if we're going to think like leaders, we have to think in terms of serving.
So, Steve, as you were sharing that, I was reminded of an experience I had actually in my small group. And we were having a conversation about leadership, and there was this shocking statement made that just was staggering. A guy looked at me and he said, we need leaders more than they need us. And my heart sunk into my stomach, and I was brought back to even that passage. But if you have any insight or thoughts on kind of that perspective and kind of how you see that lingering in church culture, like how have you dealt with that? How have you spoke to that in different environments?
Well, I think we're always going to have an entitled culture around us that tries to convince us that we need to be served and that we outgrow serving. And I think it's going to be a temptation no matter what the field, whether it's in the corporate world or the church world or on campus and academia, it doesn't matter. I think there's this working our way out of serving. But I think we've got to, again, we're talking about thinking like a leader. I've got to keep going back in my mind to, am I thinking like a servant? Am I thinking in terms of serving and putting others first? Jesus said that if you do it to the least of them, you've done it unto me. And I think sometimes we are comfortable. It's easy to serve people we think are great, and it's easy to serve those who can somehow then open doors for us, and we serve, and then we see serving as a means to the end that we want.
So how would you, in my context as a youth leader, a lot of times I'll find myself, just when you look at the org chart, I'm not the top guy, and so there's part of me that feels the need to serve my leader, just in the sense that it's his vision that we're all gathered around. So how do you balance the want to serve your leader in that capacity and be on their team, but also balance serving the people underneath you, or not so much underneath you, but the people that you're leading? Like, where's that balance fall, where you're trying to serve everybody, and meanwhile you're trying to lead as well?
Yeah, and it's a good question, and it's a dilemma that we're always in with limited time, limited resources, and limited capacity to do everything. But I think if we go back to thinking like a leader, I have to go back to ultimately I'm serving the Lord, and ultimately whether I'm serving my boss or the people in the youth group in your case, or their parents, or whatever the case is, that my mentality is, ultimately, I'm doing this unto the Lord and I'm serving the Lord. That's the heart. Now we get to the skill. The skill is time management and schedule management, and I still only have 24 hours in a day, and so my boss needs this done. This needs to happen in terms of serving the people in the youth group, and it doesn't add up. Now, there's a skill of leadership in doing your job that then we have to figure that out. But I think the most important thing is that we have the heart.
Another practical problem that often comes up when you think about the heart to serve and leading and taking initiative is, how do you balance serving and in many ways going out of your way and going beyond what's expected of you to serve others, and also delegating things to other people who you're working with, delegating things to the team?
Yeah, that's a tough dilemma that I think every leader faces. And when we go to Acts 6, we find that the apostles said, it would not be right for us to neglect prayer and the ministry of the word in order to wait on tables. Now their heart was driving them to serve the widows. And they had the right heart. And they were doing it, but it came to a point where they couldn't do both. And so that's where Mark 10 collides with Acts 6. And then what do you do when you have a heart to serve, but there's something more important? I'm pretty sure they didn't lose the heart for the widows, and they didn't lose the heart for the poor, but they had to go with something that was a higher priority based on their calling. And ultimately we have to figure out what we're called to do, but still we have to figure out ways to continue to serve in the menial. But I think we have to figure out, whether it's youth ministry or music or campus ministry, what is that core of what I have to do to make this vocation work. That can't be neglected. And then how do I serve, find places to serve apart from that?
And that also reminds me of a comment you made earlier in a conversation, Steve, that I think there's some Christian leadership kind of mentalities that are based only off the Acts 6 idea, where you're always trying to empower other people, you're always trying to delegate things so you can focus on what you're passionate about and what you're good at. But you said something great that I'd love for you just to kind of expand on, about there's some areas in that your leadership role, by going into the trenches and by serving them, actually is something that only you can do in that sense. Can you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, we were talking about a leadership phrase that's repeated, and it's actually it's truth, that a leader should only do what only you can do. So as a leader, if someone else can do it, delegate it. But how do you balance that with taking the mop or working the parking lot? There are 100 people in church who can do that, but sometimes it is important. Or like my friend in Boston setting up the chairs. It didn't take a high-skilled person to set up chairs. But the preaching of the word, he's the only one in that church plant who can do it. But he still felt the need to serve. And I think the reason is for the sake of our own soul, but also for the example. And so I think if we go strictly with only do what only you can do, then we pull ourselves out of being an example in other areas. And I think that's what my friend in Boston did so successfully by inserting himself in that servant's role. He set an example that everyone, and so who else could have set that example? That wasn't only do what only you can do. There's no one else who could have set that kind of example except the senior pastor. Other people could have set up the chairs, but no one else could have set an example of serving like that. And so it created a culture in the church that's still there 6 years later of we're all about serving, not being entitled and not having people serve us. But there is a tension, and now if it got to the point where his sermon started going downhill because he was there setting up the sound equipment, now we have a problem. But there's a way to not neglect prayer in the ministry of the word and still find a place to serve, and that's what he did.
So in my context as a campus minister, what we've noticed just in this rebuilding time with our particular ministry is that some of the means to serve from our senior leaders who have graduated already, it wasn't really passed down to our incoming class of freshmen, sophomore, juniors. So what would you suggest in how to kind of invoke those incoming leaders to have that heart to serve?
So, yeah, good question. I think that's really what this whole book was about how to solve your leadership shortage. That's what we're after. And it's creating that servant's culture. And I think one thing, I mentioned several times about Boston and what's happening there, and I think when I watched the serving and the leadership culture there, everybody was having fun. And it's hard to imagine that connecting wires and setting a stage up and stacking chairs and all of that could actually be fun, but somehow they pulled it off. It was the happiest setup crew I've ever seen, and it was a combination of fun and spiritual life happening. And I think as a leader, if we can combine those two and not have just a robotic, militaristic, we have to get a job done so we do it. Good leaders make things fun and trick people into thinking it's fun, even when it's not. And I think that has to do with our attitude. If we go about it with joy and with that really valuing the relationships, and there's something about doing it together that upgrades it, not just a task that had to be done.
Yeah, and one of the distinctions, and this is getting into, we'll get into this more in the next chapter on how to act like a leader, is that it's very possible as a campus missionary or a youth pastor or even a senior pastor to serve And to put yourself in those positions really is not necessarily in your job description. That's a great thing to have that heart. But there's a difference between being a servant and being a servant leader. And I think a servant sees a need and fills it and is humble and attacks the problem. But a servant leader gathers a team and rallies a team to help them sort of attack the problem together. And so we'll discuss it more in the next chapter, but really here in How to Think Like a Leader, we're setting the foundation for the kind of leaders we want to be and the kind of leaders we want to raise up. People who don't see serving as a means to become a leader, but people who see leadership as a means to serve and a way to really attack big problems and serve those who are around them, serve the least of these, and really see people be brought to Jesus.